between the Ibero-American Institute in Berlin and the Maria Sibila Median Center Conviviality and Inequality in Latin America, short MESILA. I am Clara Rubituso. I'm postdoc researcher in MESILA at the Ibero-American Institute. I will introduce the guest today and moderate the discussion. Our speaker today is Marília Moschkovich. She's a postdoc researcher at the Anthropology Department of the University of Sao Paulo and member of the thematic research group on gender, sexuality, and public policy in MESILA. She holds a Master in Education and a PhD in Education from the University of Campinas, Brazil. During her PhD, she was visiting researcher at the École des Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and also at the Anthropology Museum of the Universidad Nacional de Córdoba in Argentina. She was also German Chancellor Fellow from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Her dissertation, Feminist Gender Wars, the reception of the concept of gender in Brazil and the global dynamics of production and circulation of knowledge, is available online. Thank you for the open access for this amazing work. And she also published many articles in Brazilian and international journals and on gender inequalities, family, feminism. She's also an activist, she's also a feminist, and today she will speak about her dissertation and also about activism. Thank you for accepting the invitation, Marília. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Clara, and thank you, MESILA, and everyone who's here to listen to this conference today. Actually, just to let everyone know that in Brazil, most of the science is produced by public universities, and they are funded by the state, and they are free of charge to study in whether in undergrad studies or post-graduations. So when we write dissertations and theses, they all are available open access online, like the version that we presented to the jury. So this is actually really good, right? When we mention in Brazil, when I mentioned to other Brazilians that in Europe this is not the case, that you have to pay, and even in Latin America, in Argentina, which is a lot more of a democratic university system than ours, but still, like, you have to pay for some things and everything. People were kind of shocked, because in Brazil it's so naturalized that public universities, they are free and they have to remain free, although some people are trying to change that. So let's start with the topic of the conference. Well, my interest on this topic, it started when I was applying for a spot in a master's degree program at Unicamp. Unicamp is the State University of Campinas. I wanted to study the gender inequalities in academic careers, which is a topic that I still pursue and study until nowadays. And when a professor was reading my project, in Brazil, when we want to go in post-graduations in these public universities, we normally apply through a very long process of selection. So like, people comment on our projects, they comment on our CVs. It's a very long thing. We do tests. I mean, it's just very particular. But then this professor, she was reading my project. She was commenting on my research project. And she asked me, do you want to study gender or you want to study women? And I was like, I'm not sure I know how to answer this. This was in 2010, like 2009 to 2010, so it's been a while. And of course, I answered that I wasn't sure at the time, but it was part of what I would have to be sure and study as soon as I got into my master's. And then I kept studying the gender inequalities in academic career, and I started studying feminist theory more, in a more detailed way to try to understand this question, because it seemed to me that it was kind of obvious that they were connected. I couldn't tell the difference so much. At the same time, transfeminism was arriving in the Brazilian feminist public debate. So we had transgender activists bringing up, you know, many topics and issues that most people in the feminist, field, like we hadn't heard before. Some people who were very specialized in, studying travestis or other specific topics, they were already, they knew a bit of this, but this was very new in the political field, like to the activists. This was very new at the time. And because they started to raise such important issues in activism, I also realized, as I was studying feminist theory and seeing this debate in activism, and I realized for the first time that gender wasn't, sorry, that's my daughter. I'm sorry. I realized that gender wasn't as unanimous as I thought in first place, right? And I mean, this perception seems kind of obvious today that gender is not unanimous, because we've had conservative movement trying to ban and abolish, this concept or this category, like everywhere in the world, mostly in the past few years. But in 2010, when I was starting my master's, or 2014, when I started my PhD, this wasn't the case. Like, it was the dominant position of the concept of gender was very, very established. I mean, it was not something that we could easily question. So it wasn't obvious that gender isn't and wasn't a very unanimous concept, despite it being the dominant way of approaching a certain aspect of social life. So, and then that's when I started to question in my PhD, how did gender become so popular? That's the title of our conference today. I wanted to understand if it wasn't as unanimous, if it wasn't so unanimous, if there were so many people inside feminism that were questioning this category, how did it become so dominant? In order to try to not necessarily answer exactly, but bring to you a little bit of my research on this, I think we have to try to I've structured this conference or lecture through questions, right? So I want to talk to you a little bit about what is gender. So what does it mean when we talk about gender, right? Why was this concept created? What was the role of its international circulation in becoming a dominant perspective? And at the same time, what was the role of being a dominant perspective in its international circulation? How these things are together? And what does it tell us about the connections between theory production and the conditions under which theory is produced, right? How does this change the way that we understand the concept itself? What does it all tell us about how we produce and circulate knowledge in general? Like how this global and very unequal knowledge production system we have today, how does that work? So that's a little bit of what I know it's too much, but I'll try to explain the best to the best I can these main questions. So going back to the beginning of my master's and this first fundamental question, what is gender? I mean, when a category is the dominant way of talking about something, we normally have the impression that we know what we're talking about when we use that word until we're asked. And then sometimes we're not able to explain exactly what we mean when we use this word. And that's actually very useful, because then we are forced to understand all the contradictions that that it carries, right? Every concept, every theoretical knowledge, every category that we use to analyze the world, it always comes with contradictions. It always comes with dispute. Theory is not produced in a vacuum space, like in a place where there's no social relations happening. Their knowledge is always produced because of social relations, in social relations, mediated by social relations. So it matters to understand the whole context of the production of the concept of gender with the concept itself, if we want to understand a little better all of this. So gender wasn't the first concept that feminist theory produced, but it was created in a very particular context of feminist knowledge production. Feminist knowledge production was, for a long time, it was mainly connected to the political spaces. So to texts and authors that were writing political manifestos or political, I mean, their objective was connected directly to the political struggle. This happened also because until the first half of the 20th century, most women, even in Europe, even I mean, in basically all countries in the world, most women, they didn't have access to universities. I mean, some women had, but they were exceptions. We didn't have a massive entrance of women in universities until the second half of the 20th century. At the same time, in a post-war period, when we have, especially in the 60s and 70s, we have this huge thing that happens and changes the whole, frame of producing knowledge in the world, which is because of tensions, war, Cold War, social relations, so many things that were happening at that time. The role of universities is also questioned, and was also questioned at that time. So basically, what happened was people were saying, what is this knowledge produced for? Like whose interests are being taken into consideration when knowledge is produced in universities? Many people who were involved in social movements at the time, whether it was like socialist movements or the Black movement, the civil rights movement in the United States, or feminist movement, they were also questioning this. What kind of political project or project of society is taken into consideration when knowledge is produced inside universities? So this was something that was really crucial for us to understand why we had the creation of something called feminist studies and then gender studies. It started with women's studies when these women, they entered universities and they realized that women were absent of most of scholarships in all disciplines in the social sciences and humanities. And then from there, some other feminists who were in universities, they were questioning basically, okay, we can't really discuss women isolated from men. This is when around the 60s and the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, it's when the first key concepts of feminist theory were created. The idea that men and women, they are parts of a system, that there's a power relation, that you can't isolate women as an object of study, as if it was independent from everything else. So these things started to be discussed. That's when the French materialist feminists, they created, based on trying to create a strict dialogue with Marxist classic theory, they started to create this concept, it's social relations of sex. So just for context, in 1949, Simone de Beauvoir, she had already proposed that sex is socially built. So she was proposing, and when she writes the second sex, what she's basically saying is, we are looking at something here, saying it's a biological, biologically determined, but it's not. It's a, sorry, my daughter's screaming again. It's it's a social construction. She didn't propose that we change the name of sex. She didn't propose a different concept with a different name, but a different understanding to something that was justified by biology before, right? So, of course, when Simone de Beauvoir uses the word sex, she does not mean biological sex. She does not mean genitals, right? She's talking about something else. In the 70s, back to the 70s now, in the 70s, when she was, when feminist materialists in France, when they were trying to create robust theory to explain the oppression of women, they kind of went back to Simone de Beauvoir. They got this, many things they tried to understand that, and they said, yes, sex is built, is a social construct, but we have to understand it as part of a system. And that's why they proposed the idea of social relations of sex. So she was, they were basically, I mean, there's many different authors, so I'm not going to cite specifically any of them, but in general, they were building this notion that if we want to understand oppression, women's oppression, we have to understand that women and men are part of a system, that this system distributes power in a very unequal way among its parts, and they're always relational because they are part of the same thing. There's no, I mean, for us to understand the category women, we have to understand men. It's they're all based on opposites. So this is the very same basis of what normally people say that gender is, right? Whenever we ask people, okay, so tell me what's your definition of gender, or like what gender is, unless they are very, experienced in feminist theory, they will very likely say gender is the social relations, they are built according to biological sex. But if this was enough to describe the concept of gender, why would they need to create a new concept or like a different concept than what was already there? I mean, it doesn't make sense, right? That's what I thought when I was doing my PhD. It was, okay, but then it doesn't make sense. So we have to try to understand a difference. And this was one of the most important things I realized to understand how the concept of gender became popular and the effects of its popularity in the comprehension of the concept, was to understand that the concept is one thing as used by scientists, theorists, people who are doing, scientific work on this. But when it goes to the political field, when it goes to, activism, when it goes to the feminist movement, because it already comes in such a dominant position, people dispute the meaning itself of the concept. So they start to call many different things gender according to what they need it to be or what they think it should be. So we can say there are many uses of gender. There are many uses of this word in order to analyze things. Some people they do this. They use this concept gender exactly like the concept of social relations of sex or other previous concepts. So they basically say, okay, this is like about the socially built part, but there is a biological truth of sex difference, sexual difference between bodies, right? But the most innovative thing that the concept of gender brought, and that is very specific and that no other concept addresses is that even the biological sex, the difference between genitals, the difference between bodies, is produced by gender itself. Gender is not built from them, but it produces the way we classify and see them. Let's, when we have time for questions, if it's not, I can explain again, because it's kind of not always so easy to understand. But the most important thing is, because we had so many different interpretations for this concept, I started to think, so this means something, right? Okay, and what basically happens is that gender starts to be discussed and formulated as a concept from 1975 on, more or less. It comes from a very strong debate with linguistics, anthropology, philosophy, and you know, some key authors and categories that were being dealt with at the time. And it's quickly, like very quickly, incorporated to institutional sets. So we have the United Nations, international policy, treaties, public policy in government, and everything. They quickly incorporate this concept. And also international agencies which fund research, they also, now speaking as a Brazilian, when they come here to fund research on women or women's health, or, you know, they start to say, well, we want to fund gender research. I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with the concrete working conditions of researchers in the third world, but it's very precarious. And in the moment this happens in Brazil, in the case of Brazil, we were the middle of a dictatorship as well. So there were many topics of research that, I mean, it just didn't have funding, right? And then when people, when they need the funding, what I realized looking at the research data from my PhD is that when people needed the funding, they incorporated the concept of gender because they couldn't afford to not use gender. It was a trend, you know, internationally. They couldn't afford to just, you know, disagree with it and say, I'm not going to use it, or I'm going to use another concept here, because they needed the funding, they needed the prestige that comes with using this category and other things. So what do? They do something that I called in my thesis, they create these microsystems of categories. Like, they use the concept of gender, a certain interpretation of the concept of gender, but they associate different other concepts from feminist theory to the concept of gender in order to mark their position within feminist dispute. For instance, when we take it very literally to what the concept of gender is and what the concept of patriarchy is, they are not compatible. Like, in my opinion, at least from all these years of study, like absolutely not compatible. But in Brazil, it was and is still very common that researchers who had been working with the idea of patriarchy for a long time, they couldn't just say, no, we're not going to use gender. This is not, you know, an interesting category for us. So what did they do? They started to talk about gender, but associating with patriarchy. So we have, whenever a theory or a concept circulates internationally, they will arrive in different sets of social relations than the ones they were created in. So some things, some theories, some authors that they might normally not be mixable in the United States. In Brazil, they might be, or they might not be mixable in France, but in Brazil, they might be. So it's basically like it carries a little bit of the contradictions that created this concept, but at the same time, there's a huge space for creativity. So that's what basically happened when we look at the case of Brazil. That was the case that I took for my PhD. We see that these researchers, they were not only just receiving this concept or using this concept, but they were actually creating with this concept. They were experimenting sometimes in creations with this concept. And that's really interesting in many ways. And in my perspective, it should be understood as part of a resistance to not to dominant concepts and theories, but a resistance to some dynamics of circulation of these of knowledge in this global system that are very unfair sometimes and very unequal at other times, right? So when I go back to this question, what was the role of its international circulation in becoming a dominant perspective? We can say that the most a concept circulates, the most it is adopted in different countries, the more dominant it becomes in the country of origin or in the central countries in this knowledge production system. That is normally Europe and the United States, right? So it's not enough. I mean, if we think about colonialities, for instance, to look at this, we will see that it's not just a matter that it's not just an issue that the third world or like poorer or peripheral countries, that they depend on funding and agreements, bilateral agreements and so on that happen with these countries that are central. But the countries that are central, in order for their theories or authors, etc., to be established there, they also need to be popular, to be successful in this other country. So there's a mutual dependency system in a way. That's what I found through the case of gender. I am already. I mean, I don't know if I'm speaking like not for too long, but I really wanted to hear the debate and the questions. But I'm going to the end of it already now. But I think that when we look at gender and we see that people don't know exactly what they're talking about when they talk about gender, or they have very different perspectives using the same word or supposedly the same concept, this is an effect of being in a dominant position, right? One very interesting way of thinking of it is to analytically separate politics and science. So the spaces of production of politics and the spaces of production of science and theory, right? Feminism is in between them. Feminism is a very typical case of a social movement that is all the time playing with these two things, with these two worlds, right? The political world and the scientific world. So it's not a coincidence that inside feminism, these struggles between what should be or is political, what should be or is scientific, they happen all the time. And they shape things like the concept of gender, how it's used. They shape the reception of this concept. They shape how people are going to create on this concept. They shape, I mean, number of different things. It's very concerning, in my perspective, to see that now we have, after I finished my PhD, right? We have the concept of gender being on the political side, on the non-feminist political side, like on the general political arena, being persecuted, and not only questioned, but just like persecuted as some form of evil, because it makes us question nature, right? And the what nature is, what is natural or not. And at the same time, in feminism, some similar things happen. Like we had in the previous years, we also have some parts of the feminist movement, especially in some countries in Latin America, but not only, that are not questioning or improving or trying to create on the concept of gender, but just refusing it as if it was evil in a way too, right? Because there's a political consequence of the concept of gender, and why it's such a brilliant concept, actually, in my opinion. But for some people, this is why it's so evil. But one very specific consequence of the concept of gender is that we are mandatorily required to question the category woman. When we do that, as feminists, we are forced to get 100 years of our movement and say, maybe that's not really what we should be fighting about. When we are in political struggle, it's kind of very controversial what I'm going to say here, but when we are in political struggle, creating the position of a victim is very useful. It is part of a political capital in political struggles. If we can clearly say to people, look, this group of people, they are consistently victimized. That's not bad. That's very useful. And this is a very important part of what feminism was in the first, I don't know, 80 or like 100 years of its existence, right? It was just about showing people that women as a group in society, this category of people, is constantly victimized by another group. In the case from this part of feminism, men. But when we think of these relations in terms of gender, when we start to think in terms of gender, we are forced to see that it's more complex. And then maybe women, they can also oppress inside the gender system. So when we think about gender and then we question what a woman is, and then we understand that we have, let me explain this, genitalia classification when we are born, that we have gender identity. These two are two separate things, and we have sexual practices and sexuality as a third level of this system, and that one level not always corresponds to the other perfectly in real life experiences. We start to be able to understand that women, they might be oppressing people who are not women or other women inside this same gender system. So when Judith Butler asks, are women the subject of the feminism? When she starts Gender Trouble asking that. This is the question that the concept of gender forced everyone in the feminist movement to answer. And it's a very uncomfortable question. We've built a movement for 100 years, having its political subject as women, or better, sorry, having women as its political subject. And then suddenly we're forced to see that maybe feminism is not just about women. Maybe it's about this system, and maybe the system informs us of other categories, other practices, other forms of existing that should be taken into consideration as well. And that power relations are extremely complex when you we think of this way. So of course it's a very unpleasant thing. In the 2000s and 2010s, when the concept of gender was very established already in governmental policies, international policies, agencies, the United Nations, and so on, so on. People often, in feminism, people often said, okay, we can understand the concept of gender and we can understand how it helps us understand women's oppression, and not only women's oppression, but like sexual minorities' oppressions too. But what do we do if we need a subject, a concrete subject, to create public policies? This was something that was not tangible for people at the time, to think that one thing should, connect to the other. What happened then is that two different answers were given by the feminist movement and by the LGBT movement at the time. The LGBT movement answered by creating tons and tons of subjects, possible subjects, for their movement. So it was GLS in Brazil, and then it became LGBT, then became LGBTQI+, and so on. So this creation of multiple political subjects to the movement as an answer to try to capture in political terms what this theory allowed us to think. The feminist movement had an answer that I, in my opinion, think it's a lot more conservative, which was trying to stick to women in a way, or trying to define, even if with a broader definition or a little broader definition that includes transgender women, for example, but trying to create new definitions, but sticking really hard to this category woman. I don't have a conclusion about these specific differences, because this is part of what we're seeing right now. The consequences of all this, we're still dealing with them. We're still trying to solve the gender trouble, the trouble that was created when gender was developed as a concept. So it's really important that to mark that this is not final. Like what I'm saying here, it's not really final, but it really helps us understand too how and maybe why this concept became, first very dominant, and then still dominant, but really attacked, like a target for conservative movements, and also lots of not attacks, but questions inside feminism. I think that's really important. I mean, I think all this context, it's really important if we want to understand how gender became so popular and what does it mean that it became so popular. Just to close, in Brazil, when we investigate the conservative attacks to gender and the anti-gender movements and policies, there's a really interesting research from Lucas Bugarelli, a friend of mine who's finishing his PhD here. He realized when he was he's an anthropologist, he realized when he was in the field interviewing people who were very conservative and very anti-gender, he realized that one of the key things that happened was that most people in Brazil, they didn't have any contact with the concept of gender, except when the anti-gender movement started. So they knew anti-gender, but they didn't know gender before, right? Because the state started to create gender policies. It was only a few years ago that the human rights policies in Brazil, they started to bring gender as a key category to human rights public policy. And these anti-gender groups, they knew, because of this, the state was trying to bring this gender equality policies. So they were anti-gender, but their strength within communities was bigger than the state one. So what happens is people got to know anti-gender before they knew gender, which is a very different case from Argentina, for example, where you had lots and lots of gender equality policies dealing with the concept of gender, translating gender into policies, with lots of transgender directed policies and so on, to a point where people in Argentina, when I discuss with them my current research, which is exactly about the anti-gender movement, they say this would be impossible in Argentina. This wouldn't work in Argentina. Like now, I mean, it's not possible that this wouldn't happen. It's not conceivable that this would happen. So I think that all in all, when we ask how did gender become popular, I think the best we can do is try to get all these pieces of puzzles from tensions, inequalities, and lots of creativity in the middle, and try to understand that this was a production from a relationship between science and politics, which I call, in my work, I call it an interstice. So it's in this interstice between science and politics is where, feminism happens, and it's where gender happens. And this is why it's so destabilizing. Gender is a destabilizing category because you can't create a manual. It's a negative category. It makes us think of what it's not instead of making us think of what is. I don't know, I'm just going too far here, but that's basically summarizing. That's basically what I tried to bring today for you. And I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Marília.